Hi, everyone. I just want to kick things off by saying that I've given many talks at conferences around the world in the past few years, but this one today is a little special to me. This is my first time my amazing wife, Naha, gets to see me give a talk in person. She's in this room in the middle and usually hates being the center of attention, so here's a whole slide with her face on it. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Houssein Djirdeh, and I am a software engineer / developer advocate at Google. I work with the Aurora team, and I'll be talking about all the work that we do and why we do it in this presentation. Before I begin, though, I just want to let you all know that this is a front-end talk about front-end tooling. I know this is the cloud native stage, so if you expected this to be a back-end or infrastructure talk, I'm really sorry to disappoint you. So what is Aurora? The Aurora team and initiative is a relatively new collaboration between Chrome and open source tooling. Our goal is to ensure that web developers always have access to the right tools to build the best possible user experiences. Now that we got the introduction out of the way, here's a picture of my cat, Sir Maxwell. You may be wondering, why am I showing a picture of my cat? Well, we're going to use this picture of Sir Maxwell as an example of an image that a web developer, like myself, would want to load on their site. As a developer that's a little too obsessed with his pet cat, if I include an image of him on my web page, I may be worried about how it can affect page performance. The good news is that this image, let's say, only needs to render below the device viewport. So I know that it doesn't necessarily need to load immediately. For that reason, I can go ahead and use the loading attribute to lazy load the image. Okay, great. That was a pretty easy change. Now, the thing about loading content at a later point in time is that I need to be careful about it causing other things on the page, like text, to shift. So explicitly specifying dimensions of the image can decrease the chances of this happening. So I add width and height attributes. Okay, awesome. Now I've got an optimization in place that can reduce the chance of paint times being affected while also not causing any serious layout shifting. The loading attribute for images in of itself is supported in all major browsers. But for whatever reason, let's say that there are going to be some users that are accessing my website from an older browser that doesn't yet support the feature. All right then, I'll include some code that checks for the attributes, and if it doesn't exist, I'll either write a custom polyfill or fetch a third-party library that can lazy load images. Great, now I even have a backup plan to support older browsers. Thinking about my image a little more, I realize I want to improve the user experience a bit, and instead of showing nothing while the image is loading, I'd like to add a blurry placeholder. I spent some time researching, trying to find a way to do this, and I come across the blur hash library. I install it as a dependency, and then I write up some code that handles encoding the image to a blur hash. This took a little time, but I'm happy with the end result. However, I'm definitely starting to realize that there's a lot of work needed to improve how a single image loads on my web page. Anyway, moving on, I noticed that although I've got some optimizations in place to defer when the image loads, I haven't done anything to make sure that the image isn't larger than it needs to be for some devices. So now is when I begin using the source set and sizes attributes to make sure the images are responsive and work well on devices of different screen sizes. After all that work to try and improve how my image loads, I realized I need to put another image of Sir Maxwell on my webpage. Believe it or not, he's an avid fashionista and he has his own fashion blog. And like many sites, this one has a priority image that needs to load as soon as possible, and another image that is less critical since it lives below the device fold. So instead of trying to delay when the first image on the page loads, I need to try and load it as soon as possible. Luckily, there's a fetch priority attribute that works with images that allow us to provide a signal to the browser to fetch it as soon as possible. This is great, but at the moment it's only supported in Chromium browsers with versions 101 and later. I definitely want to make sure that users that access my site through any major browser get this benefit. So I consider using a different heuristic for the meantime. Link rel preload, which although has different underlying logic than fetch priority, it similarly provides us a way to inform the browser that we want to load this resource as soon as possible. Okay, so I think we've added all the optimizations that we need in order to improve how just 2 images load on my web page. But did you notice how much work we just had to do? We had to think about how to lazy load our first image while preloading the second. Using fetch priority as a priority hence was something we also needed to think about, but realized it's not yet fully supported in all major browsers. We also had to spend time trying to get blurry placeholders to work, while also thinking about responsive sizing. And again, layout shifting was something we also had to consider very early on, and we couldn't forget for many features that we worked on, we had to first check whether it's supported in all major browsers and consider if it would be worthwhile to include a polyfill. This is a lot of work, and speaking from personal experience, the amount of work needed to mitigate the impact to performance with just a single resource like an image can sometimes make me feel like I want to scream. So you can imagine how much extra effort this can take for the everyday developer who already has a million things on their mind and a long list of features and bugs that they need to tackle. Now, this talk isn't only about images, but I wanted to use image loading as an example of something every developer needs to do, but can be a ton of work if they're not careful. If we try and shift gears to the other side, how can browsers work to make images better? For one, we can continue advocating how important it is for developers to include optimizations themselves, like compressing their images and using appropriate dimensions. We can and have worked on shipping new APIs to improve image loading, like the loading attributes and fetch priority. We've even introduced newer modern image formats like WebP and AVIF that improve compression ratios significantly while still maintaining an appropriate level of quality. And of course, the browser renderer has been improved to better decode images off of the main thread when possible. And again, I'm using image loading as a primary example, but it's important to remember that web developers do a lot of things simultaneously when designing and building a website. Loading images is one of them, but so is loading and displaying different fonts, and fetching styles, and requesting scripts, and the list can go on and on and on. So if images are just one thing, let's try to zoom out and ask ourselves this. How can we make the web in general better for developers and end users alike? Chrome and Google and all browsers in general have done so much work to make the web better in all areas. The web today is vastly better than it was 10 years ago, and this was made possible through incredible contributions to web standards, extensive improvements to browser engines, and lots of advancements to improve documentation and developer tooling like DevTools and Lighthouse. But throughout this journey, we realized that there's another important piece to the puzzle we missed. What about the tools developers use? What about the frameworks, CMS platforms, and static site generators that millions of developers around the world rely on a daily basis? We've come to realize that to truly make a sizable impact to improve the user experience of the web, we have to consider developers' actual tooling. The good news is that there's already a Chrome web platform team that is working to improve content management systems like WordPress, Magento, and so on. But there's no team doing this for the JavaScript framework ecosystem until the Aurora team was born. The primary mission of Aurora is to improve user experience across the web by collaborating and contributing to open source frameworks and tooling. The key words here are collaborating and contributing. We don't want to only act as a consultancy or advisory group, but to actually design proposals and submit feature and pull requests to land new optimizations in these repositories directly. A few years ago, if you looked at JavaScript framework tooling at a glance, you would find that many of them handle multiple aspects of your application stack, like your component UI layer, how your app gets bundled, simplified file-to-page routing and layout, and some even provide middleware and deployment configurations right out of the box. But if you think about it, why can't these frameworks provide even additional functionality that's core to the user experience of the page? Like optimizing all your images automatically and by default, fetching and sequencing any third-party script you include so that it loads at the right time without affecting page performance, or even simplifying and improving the experience of including any custom fonts. If you try and separate out what a typical front-end application stack looks like, it's possible to view it in the form of layers. You have your core dependencies at the bottom, like transpilers, bundlers, and language processors. And then you have your component frameworks, like React or Vue, that most likely use some of the core dependencies under the hood. And then you have what is sometimes referred to as wrapper frameworks, like Next.js or Nuxt, that usually use a single component framework but provide a lot more functionality out of the box, like server-side rendering, file-based routing, and so forth. Angular sort of straddles the line between being a component framework and a wrapper framework. Now, not all front-end applications look like this, of course, but it's an easy way to describe a typical application structure. The reason why I'm talking about application structures is because another way to look at this is that the higher up you go, the more opinionated your tooling tends to be. On the other vein, the more you decide to rely on the more core dependencies, the more customizable things are. In Aurora, we're open to working with any tool in any level of the stack. But we've come to find that when we work on tools that are more opinionated, the more we can ship features that improve both developer and user experience at the same time. So for that reason, most of our efforts have been directed towards improving Next.js, Nuxt, and Angular. We're of course not limiting ourselves to only these frameworks, but they're the ones we've managed to collaborate with as closely as possible, and we're hoping to expand to other frameworks in the near future. Okay, we've talked about why it's so important to work closely with frameworks to make them better for all of its developers. Now let's talk about how. In many scenarios, when you think about user experience and developer experience, it's easy to think of them as two separate entities. One that focuses on what your end users experience when they access your site, and one that focuses on you, the developer, and the experience that you have when building it. When we started the Aurora project, one of the first things we wanted to do was blur the lines between them. Developers shouldn't have to shift their focus from developer experience to user experience or make trade-offs when they ship features or select their technology stack. Developer experience needs to drive user experience and vice versa. We realized that we found the holy grail of a feature when a developer doesn't even realize how much it improves the performance and user experience of their site because they're just too busy enjoying how much faster and easier it's made their development journey. To better understand how we've quantified user experience, though, we'll need to understand the core of vitals, or the set of metrics that let anyone measure the user experience of their site and identify opportunities to improve. There's largest contentful paint, an indicator of speed that measures how long it has taken for the largest elements on the page to fully load. Cumulative layout shift, which measures visual stability by calculating the number of layout shifts that occur during a page session. First input delay, which measures how long it takes the page to respond after that first user interaction. And finally, interaction to next paint, a still experimental metric that assesses the overall responsiveness of the page by measuring all click, tap, and keyboard interactions. These metrics have and will evolve over time, but we plan to continue working with frameworks to ensure that the default experience is one that meets all the core vital thresholds where nothing is compromised. There are many different areas that we think about when we try to improve UX and DX, but our closest collaborations so far have naturally landed in one of a few focus areas, including better built-in optimizations in the frameworks, improved third-party script loading, more performant and less jarring behavior for custom fonts, and even an end-to-end conformance pipeline to provide developers with actionable guidance when necessary. Let's start with the image work we've shipped. First and foremost, we wanted to make image loading in Next.js include a number of optimizations automatically without needing any developer input whatsoever. So we built an image component to do exactly that. Lazy loading, on-demand resizing, and extensive loader support are all things that are included right out of the gate. And for when developer input is necessary, we wanted to make it as easy as possible while making sure that Next.js takes care of the heavy lifting. You want to add a blurry placeholder? Use a placeholder property with a value of blur, and that's it. You want to denote a particular image as high priority? Add the priority prop, and you're done. Next.js will even identify if you have an image that is responsible for being the largest contentful paint element, and show a console warning if you're not using the priority attributes when you should. There are even more optional properties you can use, like one to control the layout behavior of an image. Layout equals fill is an example, automatically sizes your image to that of its parent element, which is a pretty nifty thing to do with a single prop. And lastly, we're always working on ways to better improve the developer experience of a component that does so much right out of the box. One of the bigger pieces of feedback we've heard from Next.js developers is that they would like the image component to be easier to style. So we've been working with the Next.js team to improve the component API and make it easier to pass styles and control its sizing. The nice thing about shipping a feature that so many developers rely on in a framework like Next.js is that we can work with other framework providers to extrapolate this work to their own communities. The Nux team have been amazing to work with, and they very quickly built a Nux image module to do exactly this. There's already a default provider, but you have the option to switch to another one that you've defined in your configuration through a single prop. Want to serve images in a different format, like WebP? There's also a prop for that. You can even control image quality with a single line of code. And preloading is even easier with the preload property, where Nux will automatically include a link preload tag in the page's head when included. The loading attribute is also present in case you want to lazy load images, and any native events emitted by the image tag can be listened to and handled directly in Nux image, like the onload event, for example. You can see that the way Next.js and Nux handle image loading isn't identical, but it's similar in the sense that it makes the entire process of including optimized and performant images as easy as possible for the developer. And just a few weeks ago, we worked with the Angular team to ship an image directive to take care of a lot of this as well. It also comes with loader support, and it will lazy load your images by default. There's also a neat priority prop that will automatically use fetch priority under the hood when included for high priority images. Angular will also warn you if it detects an LCP image that does not have the priority attributes when it should. This directive is still in developer preview, so if you happen to use Angular, give it a shot, and please leave us some feedback. In addition to the image stuff that we've worked on, we knew there was an opportunity for a component that takes care of a lot of the process and hurdles of embedding third-party scripts in an application. We created a script component for Next.js, and just like the image component, its default behavior was designed to be as optimal as possible. Need to include a new third-party script? Just place it with the script component, and that will ensure that it only loads after the page becomes interactive. That way, you can be confident that it doesn't compete with critical page resources. But there can always be some instances where we need a particular third-party script to load as soon as possible. No worries. We've added a strategy property where you can specifically choose to load the script before the page becomes interactive. And what about scripts that are very low priority that we'd like to load as late as possible? Well, there's a lazy on load option that lets you do that by loading the script during browser idle time. We wanted to see if we could push the envelope even further and give developers the option to relocate and execute scripts entirely off the main thread in a web worker. We use partytown under the hood, and there's now a worker value that you can use to do exactly this. We've recently shipped this feature behind an experimental flag, so it goes without saying, but please use it with caution if you give it a shot. And lastly, we're currently in the process of thinking of ways of building opinionated wrappers for many popular third-party libraries so that developers wouldn't have to think about which loading strategy to use. Next.js can just load these as optimally as possible. This is still very early in development, but we're hopeful that it could be an additional features that developers could find some use in. The Gatsby team also took similar steps and shipped a script component that works in a lot of the same way. Their strategies are called post-hydrate, idle, and off-main thread. And the latter here also uses partytown under the hood to offload any script to a worker thread. Let's change gears to fonts now. Very early on, when we spent quite a bit of time analyzing thousands of sites, it was quite apparent that many developers rely quite heavily on third-party font providers like Google Fonts. So we wanted to think of ways to improve how these types of fonts load with absolutely zero overhead. The thing about font loading is that it can be quite tricky. And if we're not careful, other low-priority resources could easily interfere with the external font style sheets and files that we load. we added a feature to Next.js to grab the content of a style sheet when a Google font is detected and inline it directly in the HTML. This eliminates the round trip the browser has to make to fetch font declarations, consequently improving paint times. By combining that with pre-connecting the font file and ensuring that font only gets inline during render time, this also has the benefit of minimally impacting build times as well as the time to first byte. This feature is already shipped and landed in Next.js, and it does this for both Google Fonts and Adobe Fonts. We've been thinking about possibly extending it to include other font providers in the future. The last thing I want to cover for this talk was our model and thinking on conformance. Conformance is a term that we use internally at Google to ensure that our own frameworks have the right defaults in place, but also include actionable guidance so that developers don't run into common problems that are easily preventable. In Next.js, we created a new ESLint config and plugin along with an integrated experience out of the box that makes it easier to catch problems directly in the IDE or in your terminal. We've worked with both Nuxt and Angular as well to include similar rules directly in their own tooling. We've even expanded our horizons of including guidance to other popular tools that many developers rely on. One example is Lighthouse, which will detect if your site uses Next.js, Nuxt, or Angular and display framework-specific suggestions in addition to the core messages that are already provided. I'd like to finish things off by showing all the beautiful faces of the Aurora team. We're still a small, tight-knit team, but we're grateful to have the opportunity to work with some amazing framework authors and community members to make the web a better place. I hope this talk gave a good picture of the work we do and why we do it. Thank you so much for listening.
Any questions? I have one question.
Yes.
I'm curious about how you approach the open source communities. And, you're such a big company,
Yeah.
right? And, and you can, often the philosophy is, what do you say? Like carry water, right?
Yeah.
So how did you approach them? What did you say to them to because you don't want to just go in there and say, hey, we're Google.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was a big challenge. It's something we still work with. So it took us a while to actually find, the Next.js community to begin with. So we reached out to them, actually had to meet them for months on end and kind of explain to them we're a very small team under Chrome. So we're not this giant presence in Google coming in telling you, hey, you should do this and do that because the web is slow. They've heard it. Every open source tool has heard it, right? And they have their own priorities. Right. So we kind of tried to emphasize that, hey, we understand that there's issues in the web. Thankfully, they have very similar visions. They understood that they want to make their framework as performant as possible. And we're like, we want to make your framework just as fast as possible. So we align on some goals, align on the same roadmap, agreed that the core of vital metrics makes sense. And then we actually had to take some time to build their trust. We had to first write a design proposal, make sure that the community agrees with it. Even though the Google name is still attached to it, we still have to sort of carve our presence there. And the more we did it, the easier it's become. Once we actually did that with Next.js, it's been a lot easier to do that with Nuxt and other frameworks.
Any other questions? Okay, I have another then. So I think Angular originally was a Google project.
Yes, and it still is. So Angular JS was essentially acquired by Google, and now Angular, which is Angular 2+, is a Google project. So we work very closely with them. They're not our main collaborator. We work more closely with React and Next.js, but we are this year ramping up our collaboration with them. So we definitely want to improve them as much as possible, but at the same time, we don't want to only prioritize a Google product, right? We want to say, hey, this is for the open source community. So whatever we land in Angular, we want to see it in the React community and the Vue community. So we're trying to at least balance our work there, but we also want to prioritize them as well. So even though they're very willing to work with us, we try to essentially split our time.
So I didn't see React on your number on the names of companies.
Next.js is a React framework.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's like a wrapper framework that uses, and then Nuxt is a Vue framework. So we're just targeting things at a very high level.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, thank you so much.
Awesome, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.